Welcome, everyone. We are absolutely delighted that you could join us for the first lecture in the 2021 ARISC Spring Lecture Series. In the Spring Series, we are highlighting the work of 3 early career scholars working in the discipline of geography, social science, and history. In addition to today's talk, the next presentations include infrared spectroscopy, a tool for rapid land degradation assessment, by Dr. Scott Demion at the School of Environment and Natural Resources at The Ohio State University, and that will be held on April 20th at 12 p.m. Eastern. On April 28th, also at 12 p.m. Eastern, we'll have a talk entitled Colonial Governance, Educational Reform, and the Architecture of Identity Among 19th Century Azerbaijani Muslims, by Dr. Amy Dobbs, who you just heard from, with the American Research Institute for the South Caucasus. Our website at www.arisc.org has more information on these talks under the Events tab. So today I have the pleasure to introduce Dr. Ariel Otruba. Dr. Otruba is a feminist political geographer, conflict resolution practitioner, and anti-trafficking advocate. After completing her PhD in geography at Rutgers University, she began teaching in the Sociology and Anthropology department at Moravian College in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. Dr. Etruba is also a 2021 Junior Research Fellowship awardee. Her research examines the violent and uncertain geographies inhabited by conflict-affected populations in the Republic of Georgia. Since 2011, Dr. Etruba has been studying the border securitization of the South Ossetian territory by Russian forces. Her chapter, No Woman's Land, Risking Detention Along the South Ossetian Administrative Boundary Line, will appear in the forthcoming edited volume, Invisible Borders in a Very Bordered World, Geographies of Power. Beyond her interest in border studies and critical geopolitics in post-socialist Eurasia, Dr. Etruba uses decolonial and post-colonial theory and an ecofeminist perspective to interrogate emotional political ecologies of slow violence and power asymmetries within more than human geographies. Her most recent project brings attention to the spatial temporalities of the decaying sanatoria in, I'm going to say this wrong, Saktubo, which have been home to IDPs from Abkhazia for more than 3 decades. In addition to her scholarly work, Dr. Etruba actively supports advocacy and education initiatives for a local anti-trafficking organization in Pennsylvania, Valley Against Sex Trafficking, or VAST, where she serves as a member of the Speakers Bureau and research team. Please join me in a round of virtual applause to welcome Dr. Etruba as ARISC's first presenter of the 2021 Spring Lecture Series.
All right. So today's talk, Borderization from the Frontlines, Uncertainty and Abandonment in the Space Between War and Peace, comes from the fieldwork that I conducted for my doctoral dissertation, The Violent Geography of Borderization. I completed this for my PhD in geography at Rutgers University under the guidance of Joanna Regalsa, who is joining us today, and Richard Traeger. This research was completed with the generous support of the ARISC 2016 Graduate Fellowship, as well as awards from the Eurasian Specialty Group of the American Association of Geographers and Rutgers University. I'm also very grateful to receive the 2021 ARISC Junior Research Fellowship. Many thanks are owed to a range of people who helped with the project that I'm going to be discussing today. First, I'd like to recognize the really important work of Tatuli Dobaia and Tina Gwenatadze for their assistance in the field. Second, a great deal of gratitude is owed to the numerous experts and stakeholders from civil society and government who provided key insights into this problem. And then finally, this research would not be possible without the many villagers who entrusted me with their stories. I remain humbled by the privilege to walk with them and bear witness to their intimate experiences. The August 2008 Russo-Georgian War increased the size of South Ossetia's territorial holdings and became the first time South Ossetia and Abkhazia were experienced international borders. After the 6-point ceasefire agreement ended the war, Russia unilaterally recognized these territories. Bilateral agreements were signed, which supported the arrival of the Federal Security Service Border Guard Service, whose role would be to defend the new state borders of South Ossetia and Abkhazia. These border guards proceeded by demarcating sections of the administrative boundary line using a spectrum of infrastructure, purportedly following topographic maps of the General Staff of the Soviet military published between 1976 and 1986. Metal and concertina wire fencing and green state border banners, as well as trenching, electrical and optical surveillance, observation posts, land leveling, creating an ever-expanding network of roads, policing, all hardened the once porous and invisible separation between the Republic of South Ossetia, the state of Alania, and the Republic of Georgia. The European Union monitoring mission euphemistically describes this demarcation process as borderization, referring to all the elements that prevent people from crossing from one side to the other side of the administrative boundary. Yet borderization was set in motion long before demarcation began, beginning with Soviet ethno-territorial governance, which afforded both South Ossetia and Abkhazia separate administrative statuses under the USSR. Under this system, South Ossetia became an autonomous oblast. Yet even at this point, the boundary of this autonomous oblast was not much more than a dotted line on a map. Georgians and Ossetians coexisted, integrated, and intermarried, albeit tensions. These tensions came to a head when the Soviet Union collapsed. Ossetian disenfranchisement increased as a rallying cry for a Georgia for the Georgians ushered in a series of devastating wars in the early 1990s. The conflict resulted in residential unmixing and segregation through forced displacement, which has isolated, hardened social boundaries and sowed enmity between communities. While the Sochi Agreement helped to end this war, it did not resolve the conflict. In addition to establishing a joint control commission, the agreement spatially inscribed a zone of conflict and created a security corridor near the South Ossetian capital of Tynvali, which was later fortified when the 6-point ceasefire agreement was signed in 2008. This agreement established a buffer zone between opposing forces. Both provisional agreements perpetuated an illusion of peace and stability while simultaneously helping to transform Russia from the role of mediator to occupier. Demarcation of the administrative boundary would later unfold in a succession of waves, ostensibly following the old administrative borders under the guise of sovereignty as responsibility. The first infrastructure appeared in the Georgian villages of Kamarasheni, Bani, Sidi Kuvaleti, Kveshi in the Shida-Kartli region between Gori and Tynvali. Periodic episodes continued to trigger discourses of creeping occupation and creeping annexation today. At the time of my fieldwork in 2016, border fencing remained fractured, seemingly ambiguous, and continuously, though sporadically, unfolding. In some areas, there were only banners, while in others, fences sometimes abruptly ended, sections were disconnected, and barriers varied in material, height, and size. Border studies scholar Ted Boyle argues that this borderization is de facto sovereignty materialized. The Russians acted ostensibly under a humanitarian obligation, while South Ossetians saw demarcation as establishing a sovereign rule on the ground, granting autonomy from interference from the Georgian government. Yet for Georgia and most of the international community, this border really doesn't exist. South Ossetia is regarded as Georgian territory. This has resulted in a politics defined by engagement without recognition, which has meant that formal negotiations regarding the ABL's location have never really occurred. Engagement without recognition and unresolved conflict have been advantageous, especially for the Russians. Recognition games have fostered a new form of post-Soviet liminality and a system of patronage, which have allowed the territories of Abkhazia and South Ossetia to be used as an instrument of leverage and hybrid warfare. Critical geopolitics scholars Jared Toll and Gela Mirovishvili, who are with us today, support this argument by arguing that border walling practices that have taken place along the administrative boundary line act as powerful symbolic objects in contemporary political gamesmanship. That's their quote. As a result, borderization has deepened the estrangement between Ossetians and Georgians, undermined Georgian confidence in their government, threatened key hydrocarbon and transit corridors, and impeded Euro-Atlantic integration. Although demarcation continues, I argue in my work that the ABL need not be visible, certain, or demarcated to create political acquiescence or sabotage political progress towards a durable peace. A feminist reading of borderization powerfully illustrates how this violent border geography creates political inertia, working as a tool of coercive diplomacy by operating at and between the ideological scale of the nation and the intimate bodily scales. At the national scale, borderization has worked as a bulwark to Euro-Atlantic integration, while at the local scale, bodies have become sites of public violence in which the symbolic construction of the nation and its boundaries often take place. My collective work on borderization, including this work as well as other work, seeks to use the intimate and emotional experiences of borderization to show not just what borderization is, but how it comes to operate through these local bodies. To illustrate how borderization operates at the bodily scale, I'll ask that you enter in with me a scene from my fieldwork that explores the emotional geographies of abandonment. On a humid August morning, my research assistant, Tatuli, and I find ourselves sitting on a low green bench on the sidewalk across from the driver's license center on the outskirts of Gori. Here we are waiting to meet a jolly, bald, and toothless middle-aged man who has agreed to drive us to the village of Zardi and Kari to conduct interviews for my dissertation. Over the conduct of the summer, I interviewed villagers from 21 different conflict-affected communities located adjacent or roughly adjacent to the disputed South Ossetian administrative boundary line, which Russian forces began demarcating after the 2008 war. The purpose of this research was to better understand community security and examine lived experiences by those most intimately affected by border securitization. We fumble into the backseat of his small green cab and then speed east on the E60 motorway, only to later learn that we actually had ended up in the wrong village. We had driven to Zadi and Kari instead of Zardi and Kari. You see, Zardi and Kari is in the Gori municipality, and Zadi and Kari is in the Caspian municipality. As the crow flies, this is about a 30 kilometers difference, but both villages are located adjacent to the administrative line on the Georgian controlled side. However, as I eventually learned from residents of Zardi and Kari, arriving at the wrong village was not necessarily a novice mistake. When we finally arrived at Zardi and Kari, we were met by a lively and dynamic group of women. The discussion flowed from our difficulty to locate the village. As we crowded around maps in the small kitchen, the women offered 3 explanations for why I had ended up in the wrong place. Among the reasons included the fact that the village had a similar spelling as this other village, Zadi and Kari. Second, the women explained that the village is often absent from maps due to map scale. And third, and probably most provocative, was their explanation to me that cartographic misrepresentations of their village were actually very common. Confusion comes from the fact that Zardi and Kari is often misidentified on a lot of maps. Close inspection of several maps actually later proved this. And these suggested that this was the likely result of maybe a geo-referencing error, as seen in this slide, which places Zardian Kari north of Kilchua and within Russian and South Ossetian controlled territory rather than vice versa. So actually that village is on the other side of the administrative boundary line on the Georgian controlled side. Yet what was even more striking was the malign intentions that were assigned to this cartographic error. So one woman in the group explained that the previous administration under Saakashvili had done this, quote, on purpose, and that someone had, quote, benefited from this mistake. These Zardian Kari residents went on to argue that their village was probably the most discriminated one. This costly cartographic error was faulted for dispossessing families for years after the end of the war. It was also associated with their deep sense of abandonment. Most Ossetians fled Zardian Kari during the conflict in the early 90s, and some returned in the late 90s. In 2008, 95% of the population was forced to leave because of the war. And Russian forces left the territory in October 2008. And it wasn't until 2012 when Georgian police began intensive patrolling of this village. At the start of 2016, approximately 18 Georgian and 6 Ossetian families occupied this village, though the Ossetian families were situated between the Georgian and Russian posts in an area that the public defender of Georgia described as, quote, uncontrolled. Many of the villagers of Zardian Kari were unable to return to their village due to the absence of basic living conditions and the fear of renewed hostilities in their village, as they're very close in proximity to a lot of different Russian infrastructure. At the time of my visit, the village was pretty much empty. Many of the properties had been set on fire in 2008, even after the ceasefire agreement had been signed. And the infrastructure needed to exist in the village was really largely absent, as described by my informant. To complicate matters further, Zardian Kari was never considered within occupied territory, even though you can see on the map that it's shown that way. This means that families from this village were not granted the status of being internally displaced. Instead, they were simply categorized as conflict affected, which meant that residents were not eligible for IDP social assistance, even though they themselves were functionally displaced for most of this period of time after the war. After recalling the dire conditions of the village, the women explained, "We are forgotten by everyone." A theme that actually powerfully resonated across the conflict-affected villages that I visited adjacent to the administrative boundary line. The consequences of the war have really far exceeded the tragic life and uprooted families. ABL communities have lost up to 50 to 60% of their lands because of this problem. This has incurred significant financial costs and compromised livelihoods. The human costs of partitioning have included restricted freedom of movement, arbitrary detentions, demographic declines, trauma, and significant barriers to vital resources and social practices, such as attending things like funerals and weddings. The seemingly mundane aspects of picking mushrooms or visiting the graves of loved ones are what make up daily lives in social worlds. These are the practices that make life meaningful and are what enable local people to hope, imagine, and actualize ways of being otherwise. That villagers report being forgotten or abandoned emerged as one of the most prominent and powerful impacts of borderization conveyed by my participants was really powerful. This was asserted even in spite of some really exciting investment in international development initiatives that I witnessed in different places, such as the building of schools and ambulatories. Almost every interview included some discussion of being forgotten or the death of their village. The frequency and spatial extent to which I listened to these expressions of abandonment really motivated me to investigate the conditions that were contributing to those feelings. So here's a little bit about what I learned in the process. So feelings of abandonment are rooted in the geography and materiality of borderization, produced through, at least today, I'm going to talk about 3 interlocking factors. 1, enclosure, 2, abject space, and 3, exclusions from care. Abandonment here is regarded as a state of becoming an ensuing derivative process of deprivation. The sociality of such places of abandonment are characteristically liminal and uncertain. In this case, ABL villages are neither occupied nor immune to the threat of annexation. They're neither defined by war nor peace, and they are always caught between past and future, hope and desolation. So first, enclosure has come to mean 2 things to me in this context. So first, this refers to the spatial enclosure of the village between opposing security regimes, where villages are literally kind of sandwiched between Russian FSB and Georgian police checkpoints, which often appear either in the center or at the entrances of villages. And that has a lot to do with that engagement without recognition. This has created what I term a neitherland, a transition place that exists between worlds defined by an altered sense of temporality. This term is used instead of no man's land to re-inhabit this liminal landscape, recognizing the vital importance of preventing further epistemic violence to communities who continue to experience necropolitical violence, social death, and the denial of dignity and personhood, which is central to the experience of abandonment. Enclosure is enacted through the regulation of movement as well. So border study scholars have really documented this, looking at the corporeal and affective discipline that's enacted by security architecture, showing how things like fencing and checkpoints become a source of profound anxiety for border crossers and border dwellers. These conditions isolate communities and cultivate a culture of insecurity and fear. That the border creeps and shifts through dales and forests and gardens is especially an important source of this anxiety. I argue that the threat of annexation and arbitrary detentions has actually become just as powerful, if not more so, than annexation itself for this reason. And therefore, these conditions have come to create a kind of psychic enclosure as well, which produces what Chris Philo calls a less than human geography. Secondly, abandonment is produced by the structural violence tied to the seemingly uninhabitable material conditions of many of these villages. Emotionally laden descriptions of material loss, poverty, dilapidation by research participants points to something akin to what other scholars have called abject space. Rural poverty and vulnerability are exacerbated, not necessarily created by borderization. For example, one of the principal consequences of borderization is the loss of land. This prevents local people from farming or raising animals, and compromised livelihoods limit the capacity for human agency and for people to contribute to meaningful social roles in their family and community. The loss of livelihood also means greater levels of depopulation, leaving mostly elderly residents, sometimes referred to orphaned pensioners, behind to symbolically defend these villages. The partial or lack of rehabilitation from the destruction of civilian infrastructure and residences during shelling campaigns during the war, looting, and the razing of homes has really produced a ruinous and decaying environment for a number of people. After over 10 years, many homes in ABL villages are like a living archive of decay and slow violence for this reason. Varying degrees of disrepair are evident in many of the homes that I personally visited over the course of this project. Yet while rehabilitation works and the issuance of compensation for homes damaged during the war were carried out on an intensive basis immediately following the war, At the time of my research, part of the population in Cheetah Cartley had still not received aid from the state and still bore the signs from air and ground assaults on their homes. In Zardingpari, part of the houses of the village were shelled, while others were burned, for example. Almost all the houses had been looted, and many roofs remained collapsed, blackened by soot and fire of flames and rotting from water damage. Even in the interview I conducted, most of the house was blackened, and you could smell the acrid stench in your nose while we were talking, because we were really only able to meet in one room of the home. Under these conditions, walls crumble unsteady under the weight of war and time. Shattered windows and fragments of furniture lay as if bombs were dropped yesterday. These are indicative of varying degrees of abjection. A woman in Ergneti once described to me how her and her husband had lost everything. She described how her roof was damaged, and when it rains, all the rooms become wet in her home. She was hoping that there was something that I could do for her when we were talking. Research on housing disrepair suggests important connections between substandard housing conditions and adverse physical and psychological outcomes. Moreover, it also undermines the formation and maintenance of social ties between people, whose networks become disrupted in this environment. This persistent dilapidation entrenches the liminality of conflict-affected villages and reinforces a sense of enclosure. States of disrepair create a stasis, a purgatory, and a spatial temporal surreality, which make it so difficult for life to move on. It just kind of keeps everything on hold. Citizens consider themselves to be abandoned as they become enmeshed in kind of these battles for access. The material conditions of abject states are conveyed in relation to perceptions about the withdrawal or exclusion from regimes of care, and what some regard as the state's systematic withdrawal of care and renunciation of obligation toward a population under its governance. And that's a quote from Lesham in 2017. This author reminds us that this is not necessarily spectacular violence. Instead, it's a gradual myriad of acts of inaction, systematized apathy, and indifference that becomes commonplace and normalized. Overall, respondents in my research expressed general dissatisfaction and disillusionment with many security actors, some humanitarian programs, and especially the government. Multiple participants explained that the village had no patroni, right? No one looking over them. When I asked about groups like the EUMM, for instance, the European Union Monitoring Mission, the most common response was "Araperi." They do nothing for us. No one pays attention to us was kind of this thing that was repeated all the way from No Levy to Plavasmani. And this was really in spite of 95 like NGOs and intergovernmental agencies deploying aid in the immediate aftermath of the war, and not counting kind of the ongoing municipal investment in aid programs that are being funded by groups like USAID. Nonetheless, many still perceived that the varying degrees of assistance that they had received, especially to repair damages, were partial, short-term, or just totally inadequate for what they needed. And these critiques were compounded by complaints which emphasized the seemingly arbitrary criteria of things like the targeted social assistance program, or just being classified as, quote, conflict affected or as living in a borderline village. These were perceived as also excluding people in these villages from receiving care. So for example, one woman explained how because her home had not been completely burned down, she was told that she was not entitled to any compensation. Meanwhile, others explained how they were ineligible for assistance because they were not considered, quote, permanent residents of their village, because they don't live there at least 9 months out of the year. Yet these residents at the same time explain they can't live in their village in the colder months because their home is uninhabitable because it was bombed or burned. So they're kind of in this cycle where they need aid but can't qualify for aid due to kind of the status of their home or how many months of the year that they're staying in the village. Over the course of the research, respondents argued that full displacement during the war might have granted them greater assistance under the law of Georgia on internally displaced persons, which I've often found surprising. This was in contrast to the ad hoc assistance that they received from this interim government committee that exists to address the needs of villages along the dividing line. Such examples showed how many programs were designed to enable people living in war-affected areas to sustain themselves over the short term and regain their pre-conflict levels of economic security, but how these programs failed to account for the impact of protracted conflict and ongoing borderization indefinitely, right? So it just kind of assumed that, oh, we'll give you this money, you'll fix your house and the problem will be solved. But it didn't, a lot of these programs. There was one called the ICRC Shelter Interior Improvement Program, which occupants were given enough resources to make one warm room in their house. But that neglected the fact that when the rest of the structure is unstable, that one room that you renovate is eventually destroyed because you haven't fixed the rest of the home. So a lot of people were talking about how their status affected how they were able to access care or the inadequacies of the regimes of care which were available to them. Yet one of the most striking dimensions of this research when I was doing it was that despite intense feelings of abandonment, the plight of conflict-affected communities along the South Ossetian administrative boundary line were hardly spectacle deficient. There were always an abundance of images, articles, and videos which publicly mourn the suffering of these conflict-affected populations, especially IDPs in Georgia, which I found striking, considering the prevalence of these narratives about being abandoned and forgotten. Because of this, I couldn't help but return to that question posed by the resident of Zardian Kari, who had asked, for whom did this georeferencing error in her village, who did it benefit? Were the conditions because of a lack of resources or political will? You know, what was going on here? The comments of this respondents and others like her suggested that her experience of devaluation for loss of personhood and dignity was somehow intentional. Their misidentification was not just an oversight. This is at least how they communicated it to me. Many villagers believed their government surrendered their livability and integration for the purpose of framing the violent ruptures of this conflict in a way that contributed to collective and geopolitical grievability and mourning, which could be mobilized to garner support from their Western allies. There is perhaps no greater illustration of this than the martyrdom of the late Dato Vanishvili, who passed away just a couple of weeks ago in March. Images of this elderly Kovaleti resident, who's often called Data Papa, shaking hands with various diplomats and dignitaries such as John McCain or Angela Merkel, their barbed wire has made him a charismatic flagship figure of this borderization issue. His story is famous, at least in terms of this particular problem. It always goes, you know, I went to bed in Georgia and woke up behind barbed wire. Recent headlines by agenda.ge called him the symbol of the fight against Russian occupation. Photos and videos of Vanishvili have appeared in hundreds of articles from agenda.ge, CNN, Vice News, and even including an episode of Anthony Bourdain's Parts Unknown when he visited Georgia. Behind rolls of concertina wire, his body has served as a highly visible icon that triggers sympathy, awareness, and public attention. This coverage is tactically reductive, though, framing the struggles of villagers as the direct result of Russian occupation, which obfuscates the broader rural development issues and the stagnated recovery process following the war, for which many are responsible, not just the Russians. Showing bleak and dystopic living conditions of villagers near the occupation line is merely designed to collectivize grief and transform border dwellers into a spectacle of victimhood, which makes them symbolic heroes of the nation. Such targeted encounters transform villagers into a living dead, which prevent us from understanding them as anything more than potential humans awaiting salvation by the international community. Respondents view the government's sacrifice of their livable conditions as a type of biopolitical technology of leverage. The Georgian government manipulates the affect of abandonment in ways conducive to conflict dynamics, eliciting an ethical demand for intervention. This is what Mbembe writes when he says how martyrdom comes to transform the body into a weapon. Power and value result from the process of abstraction based on the desire for enmity. This means that abandonment is not just a symptom of borderization or the war. Informants argue that the plight of villagers is also told when it is politically potent, though the narrative itself remains temporally stagnant and their conditions of precarity seemingly unaltered, right? So that idea of abandonment and liminality is perpetuated. As such, the Georgian government becomes this kind of co-conspirator, complicit with the Russians in strategically wheeling this, what Jared Toll and Gela Mirabishvili call an affective geopolitics. It's wielding the putative forces of borderization as a type of leverage. The spectacle of continued suffering, the compounding violence of uncertainty, precarious lives, and abjection, these are all exchanged within a global marketplace of international norms, of Westphalian sovereignty, and post-Cold War geopolitics and NATO readiness drills. And that brings me to the end of the talk. There's lots of things I could add, but it might be more effective just to open up for questions, and hopefully we can fill in the gaps that way. Thank you so much for allowing me to share this work.